In this video, we will explore what you can do as a developer to control what specific information you receive when a user tries to submit their data to you. Here's the use case. A user imports a file that contains 5 fields. As part of the import process, they need to map the 5 fields they import to the fields that your database expects. Let's say they only map 3 fields, so when they click the Submit button, you only want to receive the information about the 3 mapped fields. You do not want the information about the other fields. First, we'll take a look at the user workflow, we'll import a file, and we'll only map the 3 fields. I'll confirm with you that when I click the Submit button, I will only get the information about the 3 mapped fields. Second, we'll take a look at the code so I can show you exactly what am I doing to make this use case possible. And then third, I'll go over the code again to show you several things that I think you should keep in mind when you're integrating your instance of Flatfile. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's take a look at the workflow. In this tab, I have my importer open, and in this tab, I have my sample database. Notice that so far, it contains no information in it. To start, I'll import a file that contains 5 fields, and of those 5, I will only map 3 fields: first name, last name, and email. I will leave the full name and country of birth columns unmapped. When the records load in the Flatfile table and I confirm everything looks good, I'll go ahead and submit it. Once I receive the success message, I can go and check out the data I received, and I can indeed confirm that I only received the information about the 3 mapped fields. I did not receive the information about the other 2 fields. So now that we understand the workflow, let's check out the code. This code is available to you in public GitHub repository that I will link in the description of this video. In my Flatfile dashboard, I've already created a custom application called app1. As you clone the GitHub repository and you check out the README file, I'll walk you there step by step to get to this point. This custom application is powered by the code below. In it, I first import the necessary packages, and then I define my sample database. As we've seen before, it is a webhook.site server that is waiting to receive the data once the user clicks the Submit button. The code below consists of the 3 main listeners. The first listener executes when a space gets created. The second listener executes when Flatfile completes its mapping job. And then the third listener executes when a user clicks the Submit button. Let's take a closer look at each one of them. The first listener executes when a space is being created. And all that means is when you click on this button to create a new space. In my case, I've already created one, so I'll just open it in a new tab. So let's take a look at the code. The first thing I do is get the necessary information out of the event context, and then as the space is being generated, I attach a workbook to it. I give it a name workbook 1, as you can see here in the dashboard, and then I attach the sheets that I've defined in the workbook 1 variable. That variable lives in another file, and it is a simple sheet that contains 5 fields. Last but not least, I'm attaching a submit action to that space so that when a user is done working with the data, they can click on the submit button. And that's all that the first listener does. So let's take a look at the second listener. The second listener executes when a Flatfile completes the mapping job. To get to this point, we'll first import the file that contains 5 fields, and of those 5, we're only going to map 3 fields: first name, last name, and email. When I click the Continue button, the mapping job will begin, and once it's done, the dashboard will let me know. Once the mapping job is complete, the following code will run. First, we obtain the execution plan for the mapping job. That plan will let us know what fields a user mapped and what fields a user did not map during the matching stage. After that, we declare an empty variable called mapped fields that will be populated by the code below. This code goes over the execution plan and retrieves the information about the keys of the fields to which a user mapped. Once we have that, we simply push it up to the mapped fields variable. The last thing for us to do is to update the metadata of the mapped fields to specify mapped equals true. Once the metadata is updated, we're done with the second listener, so let's take a look at the third one. The third listener executes when I click the submit button. But before I do, let's take a look at the code. In the code, I first get the information I need out of the event context, and as I click the submit button, I get the information about all the sheets I'm trying to submit. In my case, it is just one contact sheet. Then I get all the records that I'm trying to submit, and I store them inside of the records variable. But I don't want to submit all the records. I only want the records associated with mapped fields. To do that, I declare a new variable, mapped fields for submit action, and I loop over the metadata of each field to see the fields that have mapped equals true in their metadata. Those fields will be stored inside of this variable. So now that I have information about the fields that were mapped, I need to get the information about their records. To do that, I declare a new variable, and inside of it, I specify what exact information I want for each record. In my case, it is the record ID, values associated with it, its metadata, and whether the record is valid. I then loop over all the mapped fields, and I only get their records. So now that we have the information about the records that belong to the mapped fields, we're ready to send the data to our sample database. To do that, I execute an Axios post call, and I send the data to our webhook receiver that we defined earlier in the code. I make sure to only submit the records that belong to the mapped fields, and as the data is sent, if anything goes wrong, for example, my internet gets disconnected, we show an error that data failed to submit. If the data is submitted successfully, then the last thing for us to do is to go over the field level metadata and delete the part that says mapped equals true. We need to do that to make sure that future imports are not affected by the matching history of the previous imports. Once we delete all the metadata, we complete the job and we show a success message to the user that mapped fields were submitted. So let's take a look at how that works. In my dashboard, I'll click the submit button and that code will execute. Once the data is sent, we get the success message and we can take a look at what we received. In our sample database, we can see that we only received the information about the mapped fields: first name, last name, and email. And moreover, we've also only received the information we wanted. So the ID of each record, the values associated with it, its metadata, and whether the record is valid. What is interesting is if I try to submit this data again, and I click on this button, the data will be sent again, but there will be no information inside of it. That is because we deleted the metadata that said mapped equals true to make sure that new imports are not affected by the matching history of the previous imports. So now that we fully understand the user workflow and we know the code that makes this use case possible, I want to show you two things that I think you should keep in mind when you integrate your instance of Flatfile. The first thing you should keep in mind is when to execute your code when it is filtered for a specific job. Let's take a look at my code. You will notice that each of the three listeners are filtered for their specific job. The space configure job, which executes when I click this button to create a new space. The workbook map job, which executes when I click this continue button. And then the workbook submit action job, which executes when I decide to submit the data. You will notice that inside of my first listener and my third listener, I decide to execute the code on job ready event. According to Flatfile documentation, job ready event fires when the job is ready to execute. So in the first listener, after I click this button to create a space, but before the space is created, I'm attaching my workbook, my sheets, and my submit action to it. In a similar way, inside of my third listener, after the user clicks the submit button, but before the job is complete, I'm executing all my custom code to only submit records of mapped fields to my sample database. However, inside of the second listener, you will notice that I'm filtering for workbook map job, but I decided to execute it only when the job is complete. The reason I do that is because workbook map job is responsible for important data processing. It takes into the account the decisions I made during the matching stage, and once that job is done running, it presents me with the records inside of the Flatfile table. That job is native to Flatfile, so we don't know exactly how it runs under the hood, and we don't want to interfere with it. Therefore, we wait for that job to be complete, and then we execute our custom code. So that is the first thing you should keep in mind, is when to execute your custom code when you filter it for a specific job. The second thing you should keep in mind is how you structure your code depending on what kind of a job you're working with. So let's take a look at the structure of my code inside of the first listener. In here, you'll notice that before I do anything, I first acknowledge the job. According to Flatfile documentation, when you acknowledge the job, you move its status from ready to executing. So now that we tell Flatfile we're ready to execute this job, we're telling it exactly what we want it to do. In this case, create a workbook that contains a sheet and a submit action, and then once this custom code is done running, we either complete the job if everything goes well, or we fail the job if something goes wrong in the process. But notice the structure. We first acknowledge the job, then we run the custom code, and then we either complete or fail a job. The reason we do that is because space configure job, by default, all it does is it creates an empty space. It doesn't know what to do after that. Therefore, Flatfile expects us to tell it what to do, so we're telling it when to start executing that job, what to do as it executes, and we tell Flatfile when to complete that job. By the similar fashion, if we take a look at my third listener, over here before I do anything, I first acknowledge the job, then I execute all the custom code inside of it, and once it is done running, I complete that job. The reason the structure here is the same is because by default, workbook submit action is a custom job that we created. So Flatfile doesn't know what to do with it. So once the user clicks the submit button, we tell Flatfile, let's move that job to the executing status. Let's execute the custom code over here and then complete the job with a success message to the user. So the structure between the first and the third listeners are exactly the same. However, when we take a look at our second listener, you'll notice that the structure is different. Notice that I'm not acknowledging the job and I'm not completing the job. All I'm doing here is providing the custom logic to execute once workbook map job reaches the job completed event. The reason I'm not acknowledging this job or completing is because workbook map is a job that is native to Flatfile. The Flatfile team has already decided how and when to acknowledge this job under the hood and how and when to complete it. If I also explicitly tell it when to be acknowledged and when to complete, I risk into making this job not run as expected and my Flatfile experience will be broken. Therefore, only when that job is complete, I'm telling Flatfile what to do and nothing else. I'm doing as little as possible to intrude in how this job is supposed to work. So that is the second thing you should keep in mind, is how you structure your code depending on what job you're working with. This is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. In the description, I will leave a link to the GitHub repository so that you can easily access the code, and I'll also provide the links to all the Flatfile documentation that I've referenced throughout. If you have general feedback about this video, or you have ideas about the future use cases you'd like me to cover, please leave those in the comment section. If you like what you've seen, please like and share this video, and subscribe to the channel as I will be releasing new videos at least once per month. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.